Welcome everyone to our CPD Live for Neuroscience, Educational Theory and Effective Teaching Practice. That is rather an ambitious title for obviously a single session. We only have 1 hour, so I'm going to do my very best to get through as much as we can. We're going to cover a whole range of different areas. We're going to cover some aspects of teaching theory that you might have heard of. Perhaps we're not going to cover some of the ones that you've heard of in very much detail. And then we're going to talk a bit about cognitive load theory, schema theory, neuroplasticity, and then hopefully we will get a chance to discuss how you can apply some of this in an everyday lesson so that it's a bit more directly applicable to you. So first of all, a little task, just 2 or 3 minutes, just to have a look down this list of statements and to assess for yourselves to what extent you think it's true, partially true, or complete rubbish. So have a look down this list. What do you think? Any of these, are all of them true or all of them false? Or is there some that have got some credibility and perhaps some that are not as credible? Okay, right. Anyone willing to throw their hat in the ring for the first one? All individuals learn best if taught via their preferred learning style. Good. In the middle or rubbish? Okay. I can't hear you. David, I see you're trying to say something, but I can't hear anything you're saying, I'm afraid. Who thinks
good?
Good.
Yeah.
A couple of people think good. Who thinks in the middle? Not many. No one's going to put their, or sort of Danielle in the middle. Who thinks rubbish? Tony. Only Tony. Somebody else put that. Faith. Okay. This has been very, very popular for a long time. Has anyone heard of visual, auditory, and kinesthetic?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's been very popular for a long time. About 10 to 12 years ago, a series of papers came out that said it's actually not really got any basis. Now, this has probably been quite persistent because we all see and meet people who have a preference, sometimes a strong preference for what they can, how they learn best. But the reality from the evidence we've got so far is that almost all humans, with the small number of exceptions for people that have got very strong, like for people, example, if people are blind or something, almost all humans are much, much more focused in terms of their visual processing. And actually, most people, their visual processing is their primary mode of operation. And this is the case for almost all apes. This is not something this is just specific to humans. Almost all apes are primarily visual. We use our eyes to do an awful lot of our navigation of the world. We also have a pretty good sense of hearing. For apes, our sense of smell is pretty bad. No one says we've got an olfactory learning style where you learn by smell. Obviously, that would be nonsense. And kinesthetic has been largely refuted as a learning style, and it also ended up with some quite bizarre things that were going on around 20 years ago, where people were saying ended up that almost all of the students that were doing less well were branded as being kinesthetic, and so they were given plasticine models to do and all these sorts of things. But the evidence shows that that's actually not that doesn't help them in any credible way. So people don't tend to have actual distinct neurological learning styles, but they often have a preference. That preference might not be, it might well be legitimate that they have a preference, and it might well be useful to take that preference into account. It doesn't mean we should say, well, you prefer learning by listening to an audiobook, but we're going to ban you from doing that because I don't believe in it. That's not necessarily, we don't need to do that. But learning styles has been debunked a couple of times over the last 15 years. And so this is not something we need to just give too much focus to. Right. Second one, intelligence is genetically determined and cannot be changed. Who thinks this one is good? No, we've got quite a few thumbs down here. Anyone willing to support this one? No. Okay. This one has partial truth in that there is genetic influence. However, the idea that you've got some sort of fixed level of intelligence that can be depicted by a single number, like an IQ, is deeply flawed, if you put it mildly. And in some cases, you could just say it's much more harmful than it is helpful. Mary said you can have a brain injury affecting intelligence, can't you? Brain injuries and pathologies have been a fascinating way to study all kinds of neurological function, both deliberate and accidental. So there was a guy who, for example, who was building a railway in the US in the late 19th century, had a tamping pole, which is basically this sort of a 3-inch diameter iron pole blown up by dynamite through his skull, straight out the top, and it literally blew the whole tamping pole, which was about 6 foot long. Phineas Gage, Tony, you know it. And it blew up through his head and all the way out of his head, and he was still alive, surprisingly, but he could only say tan. All he could say for the rest of his life was tan. So he just walked around going tan. Obviously, people at the time had no understanding of, number one, how this bloke survived this 3-inch tamping pole blowing through his head, and also why this happened. So yeah, the pathologies can be really interesting and useful. They don't necessarily affect intelligence in all cases. It depends how much of the brain is damaged and which parts of the brain are damaged. But intelligence is definitely, there's a genetic influence. People's ability to do a whole range of different things has genetic influence, but it certainly can be changed. And it's just as good, just as well it could be changed. Otherwise, teachers would probably have not much of a point of us being here. If everyone could just learn depending on their genetic ability, then teaching is pointless. Obviously, teaching is not pointless. That's definitely not true. So this one is mostly false. Right, 3. There are multiple different forms of intelligence. Who thinks this is good? Who thinks this is rubbish? Mary's laughing. I don't know, Mary, if you think that, if that's, does that mean rubbish? Does it mean you just think this one's hilarious, or? Oh, okay. Fair enough. There are different forms of abilities, but the idea that there was some kind of separate, discrete forms of intelligence is also mostly in the bin now. It was quite common and quite people quite enthusiastic about this about 10 years ago. Howard Gardner, that's it. Howard Gardner and his multiple intelligence theory. People started having a cottage industries of sort of separating intelligence in different categories: emotional intelligence, musical intelligence, sporty or athletic intelligence. Now, there are definitely different areas of ability, but they're not necessarily different areas of intelligence in the sense that they make you it's easier or more difficult to learn in that particular area. And the real risk with these kinds of intelligences is when we try and say, well, you've got loads of musical intelligence and you don't, but you've got more mathematical intelligence or whatever else we want to call it. It implies that some people are more capable of learning these things than others. Now, if they are more capable of learning them, it's normally because of other factors, not some sort of ingrained form of intelligence. So there are definitely different forms of ability, but in terms of intelligence and the ability for people to learn about things, more or less, we've debunked that one as well. Okay. Anyone willing to think that using 5 to 10% of your brain at any point in time, is this true? Or is it rubbish? It's rubbish. This is probably my pet hate, actually. And there was a film. Does anyone remember there was a film about this? About if some like mad scientist could unlock more of your brain, and then you get superpowers and you could fly and do all this wacky stuff. You could basically be like a supercomputer. Oh my goodness, I despise that film. I thought that was the worst film that Hollywood has ever produced in their entire long history. But if I can't remember what it was called, and good riddance to it. Anyway, this is complete nonsense. This is like saying that a company only uses 5 to 10% of its staff at any one point in time. It doesn't make any sense, right? The cleaners might not be cleaning right now, The CEO might currently have gone to the loo or be sitting at home on his day off, or whatever. But the idea that a company only uses 5 to 10% of its staff at any one point in time is obviously rubbish, because different staff do different things, and they may have more or less to do at a different point in time, but they're all still doing something at any given week. We're going to go through the last two fairly quickly. Individuals with left brain focus and right brain focus. A big focus on left and right brain. Anyone think this is really important? Rebecca, you've said. Anyone who feels like it's been overemphasized? That's probably the best summary of this. This one's been overemphasized a bit. Yes, there are differences in the way the left brain and the right side of the brain tend to operate. However, people have then looked at an MRI scan where the left part of someone's brain is lighting up and then drawn conclusions that are not really very well supported. And as Tony's just pointed out, it crossed over. Both sides are completely well connected, and actually both sides of your brain are involved in most tasks you undertake. Again, there is an exception if you've got serious brain damage and part of your brain doesn't work at all. Right, last one. You can remember 10% of what you read, 30% of what you hear, 50% of what you see, and 90% of what you teach to somebody else. Anyone in support of this? Ben? Anyone else? Lisa? David's on the fence. Anyone think that this does not make any sense? Nobody. Everyone's in support. I'm sure I saw someone put thumbs down. Who has ever seen a science experiment which produces nice answers with multiples of 10? Who has ever seen who has ever read a scientific paper where the answers are all 10%, 30%, 50%? No. If anyone has ever read any scientific papers, they never come out with 30.0%. For some reason, they just don't. And they certainly don't come out with 5 different sets of results that all have very nice, neat percentages like this. This was made up by somebody. This was made up by a guy called, what's his name? Richard Dale in the 1950s. He wrote it at the back of one of his papers and just drew basically a sort of a sketch diagram and said, I reckon this. It was made up. It was never actually based on a scientific experiment, and partly because there's no kind of scientific experiment you can plausibly devise which can produce this kind of result anyway. But it was entirely made up. And then, unfortunately, lots of people cited his paper afterwards and repeated it as though this was some sort of discovered fact. He just guessed. He just made it up. Now, if you ask somebody who's read, for example, who here has read Harry Potter? Somebody must have read Harry Potter. It's one of the most famous books. Okay, a couple of read Harry Potter. Do you think you only remember 10% of the plot? No, it's nonsense. The idea you've only remembered the names of 10% of the characters and 10% of the plot, and then you're walking around scratching your head going, who on earth is Ronald Weasley? It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? This idea that you only remember 10% of what you read and then 50% of what you see, and then if you teach somebody, then magically you've learned everything. I'm very, very sorry. This is complete rubbish. And it's probably the worst. Well, actually, no, it can't beat the 5 to 10% of your brain one. That one I despise that one, but everything. But this is probably the second worst. Okay, we're going to move swiftly onwards, otherwise we won't get through everything. Why learn about neuroscience? I hope you're convinced, at least now, that some of the myths that people have come up with at least mean that we should learn something about it. So, neuroscience explains how we learn. And there is one very, very common phrase in neuroscience that is probably quite useful for us to learn. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Now, this is important because neurons tend to represent neurons fire for particular reasons. Some neurons fire because we can see something that's really bright in one part of our visual field. And obviously, that neuron represents that there's light on the left-hand side of your visual field. Some neurons fire when we are scared of something, or when we see something which is a flat line, or when we see something which is whatever other properties, when it's red or whatever else. So neurons are effectively our minimum processing unit within the brain. And if they fire at the same time, they build connections with each other. And this is very, very useful. Now, Chrissy, you've got your hand up. But you're also on mute, so I can't hear what you're saying. And you put your hand down. Okay, fair enough. So, neurons that fire together, wire together, and this phrase is very important. Now, cognition is thinking, and this is at the core of learning. And we're going to take a little bit of time just to go through this, because this really gives us a bit of an understanding as to what on earth is going on in the brain. But this is effectively a very simplified model. So what does our brain get? What can our brain do? So our brain is like a computer that takes in all this information, but it doesn't just take in information from the outside world, which it does do, obviously. So you can see things, you can hear things. Hopefully you can hear me. If you can't hear me, it's going to be a bit pointless. And you can smell and taste and touch things. So you have sensory stimulus that comes in to your brain and gets processed. Now, obviously, for some people, if you've got a sensory deficit, like, for example, you're blind or partially sighted, you will tend to, your brain will rewire itself slightly to overemphasize inputs from other sensory stimuli because you don't have any visual processing. So this is where we can say where we have the visual auditory kinesthetic idea, where that originally came from. Whilst the vast majority of people who have not got a sensory deficit, so for example, people that where they're not blind, deaf, or anything like that, their processing almost always is pretty similar. There's not really any substantial difference in the brain between healthy people. However, if you take someone who is genuinely blind, they obviously don't have very much visual processing in the brain going on at all because they can't see. But they have a much better developed form of touch, for example, and of auditory processing. We also have two other things that are really important. One is emotional state. An emotional state comes from the fact that humans we're not designed as computers. Humans are living things that want to avoid being eaten, want to find things to eat, and want to find safety and mates and all the rest of it. All the other things that are evolved very deeply ingrained within evolution in the animal kingdom. An emotional state is effectively a very blunt steering mechanism to enable us to find things and go to places that are likely to be safe and to give us food and shelter and all the rest of it, and to avoid things that are likely to cause us harm. So, for example, if anyone has ever smelt a rotten fish, okay, you probably remember the experience of it smelling pretty terrible. Agreed? Yeah. And you did not for a moment think it would be a nice meal. In fact, rather the opposite. You probably felt like you'd be sick if you ate any of it. So this is something that is very deeply emotionally ingrained. Things like disgust are very visceral. You don't need any cognitive processing. You don't need to be a genius in any sense of the word to realize that eating a rotten fish is probably a bad idea, right? It's almost completely an emotional response to someone. If someone says, do you want to eat this? You go, no. And you don't need any kind of intelligence or specialist knowledge to be able to make that decision. Likewise, if you're absolutely terrified because someone's turned up to your house wielding a machete and threatens to kill you and your family, your emotional state is clearly going to be profoundly impacted, and the way you act and process that is going to be profoundly impacted. If someone was to sit you down with this machete-wielding madman outside your house and go, let's do some algebra, you're probably going to turn around and say no, perhaps in a more blunt and direct kind of fashion. So emotional state is going to profoundly affect everything that our children do. Now, we're not going to talk about it in great level of detail today, because that could kind of be an entire separate session or series of sessions all by itself. I'm just making it clear to you that this is something you need to consider. If someone's emotional state is extremely in a severe position where they're not able to learn, none of the rest of what we're talking about today is going to make any difference, right? They need to be in a relatively calm emotional state before they're going to do any other processing of any other complex stuff. Otherwise, they're just in fight or flight mode and they want to run away, or they want to throw the table around the room or whatever. And the last thing we're going to talk about as an input is prior knowledge. When you hear or see things, you will interpret it through the prism of what you already know. So if someone's talking to you, you obviously already know English. I hope you can all speak English, otherwise it's going to make no sense to you. You can already understand English, and therefore you can process it. If you already speak other languages and they was changed to one of the other languages you can speak, then lucky you can already still understand them. But if they start to mention things that you have no knowledge of, it's not going to make much difference. Now, Danny has just said, imagine if schools understood that children can't process things properly when they're in emotional states. Well, quite. Schools have a difficult job in that obviously some students turn up to schools in all different emotional states. And sometimes the emotional state of the children when they've turned up is wholly unsuited to complex learning. And if that's the case, we then stick them in an environment and just say, well, you're going to do complex learning anyway. That might be problematic. And if you're lucky, right, you get one-to-one, or you're one-on-one with a group, and you can cater to some extent for students in a different emotional state. Schools, perhaps they need to manage that, and they don't necessarily always do it really well. So prior knowledge, sensory stimuli, and emotional state. These are the primary input factors for your brain. And the outputs are, first of all, instinctive responses. If when I mentioned a rotten fish, anyone thought, wow, that's delicious, most unusual. If anyone thought smells disgusting, I remember that's horrific and I feel vaguely ill, then that's an instinctive response. No teaching was required at all. Just likewise, if someone like throws a ball at you and you blink, instinctive response. Then the other two outputs are changes to emotional state. Oh, three outputs, sorry. Changes to emotional state. So if someone can calm you down, if you feel like you are safe and the mad axe murderer has been taken away and the other factors that were upsetting you have been taken away and the smell of rotten fish is gone, you can be calmed down and feel like, well, actually, the world's not still so terrible. It might take some time, but there can be changes to your emotional state. Likewise, it can get worse. If 3 more wild machete-wielding murderers turn up outside your doorstep, you're probably going to be more upset and terrified than less. The third one is the really important one, modifications to schemata. And this is learning. And the last one is actions. So the last one is you can just do stuff. You could decide, you know what, I don't want to stay here. I'm going to leave. I'm going to go somewhere else. Or I'm going to pick up my pen and write. Or I'm going to put my hand up and ask a question. So there's all these 4 outputs. The instinctive ones, changes to emotional states, modifications to schemata, which is what we're going to talk about now, and then just actions. So the modifications to schemata is going to be something we're going to come very, very quickly onto. First of all, we need to cover this idea of neuroplasticity. And then after that, we can do the schema theory, cognitive load theory, and practical applications and techniques. And we're going to whistle stop. We're going to go through these at blinding pace. And I hope we give you just enough to make you a bit more interested to explore it in further detail. And if you want TTA to do these in more detail in future, then we can. But hopefully it'll give you something. So, neuroplasticity. Anyone ever heard of this before? Thumbs up if you've heard of it. What is it? Anyone willing to put their hands up just to offer a definition? No? Well, I suppose you're all sitting here going, well, John, you're the one that's living this session. Why don't you do your job? Neuroplasticity. That's it. Sheila. The idea that the brain can be modified, and the word plastic means that when you modify, it stays modified. Plastic in physics is the opposite of elastic. Elastic means you stretch it, and when you let go, it pings back to its original shape. Well, the idea of plasticity is when you change it, like plasticine, you can change it into a shape, and it will stay in that shape. Neuroplasticity is the idea that you can change the brain, but the change can be permanent. And there's an awful lot of things you can do to change the brain, and an awful number of ways you can change it, some of which we might think are good, some of which we might think are very bad. People who have become deeply traumatized in their life might have had very serious changes to their brain, which we might not regard as being very useful, because they might now be completely terrified of all men, for example, if they've been severely abused by several men in the past. But in an educational context, we obviously are talking about people learning things and having remembered those things and then building on top of those in the future. Now, we need that. Oh, there's a spelling mistake. It should say schema theory, but obviously the autocorrect has intervened here. And schema theory is the next thing we're going to talk about. Schema theory is about how we remember information. Now, we don't tend to remember information like a filing system. where we just go and retrieve file 117A and it says, oh, when was the Battle of Hastings? 1066. That's not how we tend to remember stuff. We tend to remember stuff as a network of related information. So, for example, we've got this image on the right here. We've got networks of information for almost every idea, and they're all interconnected. Now, some of those connections are hierarchical, and you can go up and down the hierarchy from more simple to more complex. And some of them are trans-domain. They link to different things in different areas of knowledge. So we've got an example here about house. Obviously, you can think of some more simple things. What is a house made of? Bricks, in the Western world at least. What are bricks made of? You might know. They're made of fired clay. Okay, fine. What are the features of a house? You can probably list them, right? All of you are very capable people. This stuff is quite easy. You've got a lot of knowledge that links to the idea of a house. You might have seen houses of different types, big houses, small houses, houses that are desirable, houses that are undesirable. And you can link. There's an example of a trans-domain link would be knowing the word house and knowing information about a house in another language or another cultural context. If you're an anthropologist and you've studied people in Papua New Guinea, you might be very well aware that the houses they live in Papua New Guinea are not the same. Okay, the houses they live in China, perhaps in some cases, are not the same if you go to some sort of rural Chinese village. And this network is effectively your knowledge of a house, and you can navigate within that network with relative ease if you're relatively familiar with it. And the more you navigate within that network, the more strongly you remember everything within it. So if I ask you for your mother's name, it's extremely unlikely you've forgotten, because within your knowledge of your own family, your mother is probably someone who you're quite well aware of. Whether she's alive or dead now, you're probably someone that you've got a very strong understanding of who she is, what she did, and all this of it. However, your knowledge of somebody else's family, your network and your schema for them is probably a lot more limited, right? You might know some of their relatives, but you might not know any of them. So a schema is really a network of information, and the plural is schemata because it's a Latin word. And this is how we remember. So when we're teaching people, we want to add things to their schema, preferably to the schema that's in the domain of the subject we're teaching. We might also want to make links between what we're teaching and other things that they already know about, because that's going to help them access the stuff we're teaching them. If they love football and they absolutely despise maths, especially in the early days when their knowledge of maths is very limited, we might need to bring some references in so that we can help them to anchor it to something they already know. Got a question or point from Mary here. If a student likes jellyfish, are they more likely to remember how to find the mean if I do an average number of tentacles? Similarly for conversion. Yes and no. The answer is that the linking it to these things will be, it will mean that if they already are very familiar with jellyfish and they know jellyfish very well, and they live on the coast and they love collecting or whatever, they're likely to be more interested in discussing things they already know. However, it should not become a distraction, but actually they're now focusing more on the jellyfish than they are on the task you actually wanted them to do. But it does mean that if they are already familiar with something, then you don't have that extra hurdle to overcome. And the cognitive load theory is relevant here in a minute. So the short answer is yes, probably, but don't get distracted. Yeah, and real life examples that are relevant to students they can understand are helpful, because it means they don't have to do very much processing for a familiar topic. If you ask them to calculate something which is very abstract, that can often involve a lot more processing. But we're going to come on to this with cognitive load theory in a minute. So, why is it relevant to education? The main thing that this is relevant for is because if we want someone to learn, we need to build connections between existing unconnected ideas, or between existing ideas and new stimuli. So, there will be a point at which in time, for example, you will have smelt rotting fish for the first time. It would have been very, very hard to explain to you before you first smelt rotting fish quite what that experience was going to be like. Agreed? Anyone agree with that? Or does someone feel like they can explain what rotting fish smells like without anyone having smelt it before? Yeah. So in that case, when there are unique stimuli, they generally they need to be experienced before we can create an existing connection to that. Normally, when we're building connections in education, we are connecting existing ideas they've already got that are unconnected or that are comparatively meaningless. If, for example, you're going to teach someone Chinese characters, yes, the Chinese characters in aggregate are unique and new, but actually they're still combinations of lines and curves, which students will technically have as an existing idea. They know how to draw. They know how to draw pictures. And so the idea is that Chinese characters aren't completely novel. It's compositions of things that they didn't really have any knowledge of, right? If you show someone a Chinese character and they can't speak Chinese, they just won't have any meaning. They'll probably know it's Chinese or it looks a bit Chinese. They may not be able to tell the difference between Chinese and Korean or something, but they'll know that this looks like some kind of Far East script. And then you need to build up their knowledge of different components and of all the rest of it. Now, education is about developing more richly developed schemata. And the more richly developed their schemata is, and the stronger the connections between related ideas, the more likely it is they're going to remember it all. Okay. But the development must be selective. And I put in here developmental biology and synaptic pruning, and that probably means nothing to some of you, so I'm going to explain it. When you're first born, you start off with loads of connections all over the place in your brain. And there are at 2 points in your life, one at the age of around 4, 5, 6, and one at the age of around 13, 14, plus or minus a couple of years, where your brain goes through a process called synaptic pruning. And it takes this huge network of connections and cuts off loads of the connections that don't seem to ever be used. Okay. And this is how developmental biology works in the brain. Your brain basically makes loads of connections in the beginning to see which ones it's going to need. And then whichever ones it doesn't ever end up needing, it goes, well, these are pretty pointless. We're going to get rid of them. And what you're left with then are the connections your brain has, by prior usage, determined are more important. The phrase use it or lose it does apply as a general rule in neuroscience. If you've never ever needed to do something, you're going to forget. Okay. Whereas if you've done something many, many times, for example, used your mother's name because you've called her, Mum, can I have this? Mum, can I have that? Whatever. Then you're going to have a very strong memory of it. And so development has got to be selective. Children aren't inherent geniuses just because they've got all these connections, because their brain doesn't know which ones to prioritize. If you ask them about something, they might come up with 25 different ideas. And I know there's a guy called Ken Robinson who did this sort of exercise with children. He said, well, they've got all this creativity and school destroys it and takes it all away. Well, that's not quite correct, because it's not school that does synaptic pruning. Synaptic pruning happens anyway, whether or not the children go to school. But what happens is children have loads and loads of ideas about things because they've got all these connections. But loads of those ideas are actually genuinely rubbish, as in they won't work. Children could draw lovely pictures of an amazing machine, and they could be encouraged to learn and to develop more and to use that curiosity. But it doesn't mean that the drawing that they've made is suddenly going to be really useful to a world-class engineer and they can design and build that machine, right? Otherwise, why do we have engineering degrees? Just get 5-year-olds to do it. But obviously that doesn't work. And this is why. Development must be selective for us to have a positive educational outcome. There are specific links that we must build and maintain and strengthen. For example, processes that really work, how to carry out a certain method in maths, how to understand a certain theory in science, how to write an essay in English or in any other subject. But it has to be selective. We can't just go write whatever you want. When you're going to write 4 paragraphs in an English essay, write whatever you like, write whatever comes to your mind. Because there are, objectively, there will be some things that are not going to be relevant to the answer. And they wouldn't do very well. So it has to be selective. We are trying to get people to be selective in terms of the connections they are strengthening, the methods they're prioritizing, because having 100 connections is all very well and good if you're just going to use trial and error, which is what children tend to do. We need to help them narrow down which ones are most important for them. Any questions on that so far? JP?
Hi. My question's about natural talent. So some students are very artistic and they can draw images much better than anything I could ever draw, even with practice. How does that factor into the kind of neuroplasticity of this?
Yeah, so partly we don't have a definitive answer, but we can make some guesses as to what might have happened here, right? There is, when the brain develops, there is some extent to which there is an element of randomness. Now, it's not completely random, like everything gets wired up by completely randomly, but there will be some combinations in which neurons have connected in the first instance, which just so happen to have been strengthened at a very early age, possibly by chance, possibly because they were in some ways mark making, but likely there's some element of chance involved, which then gives them an advantage over other alternative forms of wiring. If you just take 1 million brains and you wire them all in mostly a similar way, but with 10% of variation, by definition, some of those variants will be better suited to some outcomes than others. Now, what's probably more important is that when students are 5 and they start doing maths for the first time, some children get told, wow, you're great at maths. Not because they did anything, they've not done anything really advanced, they've just counted or something, but because they counted comparatively well for their age or because of their expectation, they've been told, wow, you're so amazing at maths. And the expectation in their mind has gone up. And so what they will then, how hard they will try, they will try harder because their expectation is, I'm good at maths, so I'm surely going to get this right. Some children will obviously be told, you're terrible at maths. That's awful. You can't count to save your life. Now, obviously, the opposite effect will happen where they'll think, well, I won't bother trying very much because I'm not very good at maths, so it doesn't make much difference. Now, ideally, I suppose, we want everyone to believe they can become good at something, because even if there's, let's say, and I'm arbitrarily picking a 10% variation number, right? This is a complete made-up number. This is not definitive fact, right? But let's imagine there is 10% of variation in most healthy children at birth. Some of those will by default just be slightly better or slightly worse at certain tasks than others. And the way some of them are wired up will mean that they grasp some early concepts a little bit quicker than others. If that is then positively reinforced very extensively, that will create a wide divergence in ability quite quickly between those children and children that, to start off with, had a very slight deficit by comparison. But because they were told, yeah, you're all right, you can try a bit, they then develop less quickly because they were never given as much stimulus, as much information, all the rest of it. You can take examples from history and all the rest of it where people have been given quite intensive training at a young age, and they've then become fantastically good. Like Mozart, for example. Mozart's parents were both musicians. So maybe Mozart was quite good in the early days, but also he was given a violin and given intensive musical training from the age of 3. So do we know for sure that he was genuinely talented, or was he just genuinely really well prepared from a very young age? And his parents presumably thought there's no other way you're going to succeed in life other than being a fantastic musician. So keep trying. And he did. And it obviously worked, right? We all still know he's a famous musician. So I think there is an element to which there is minor variation definitely in young children for ability in any given field, but that the way we positively reinforce them and perhaps differentially reinforce them is what creates the biggest divergence, is my suspicion. I have to confess, I don't have really, really strong evidence for that, because that's based on me reading between the lines of like 5 or 6 different academic papers that I know about that kind of triangulate to that conclusion. If you can find out something that's a bit more conclusive than that, then send it to me and I'd be really interested. Okay, I'm going to crack on because we're running out of time. Building connections requires effort and working memory, and this is the next thing we're going to talk about. Cognitive load theory. So the main principle here is we don't have that much thinking capacity. We can't actually do that much thinking at the same time. So we need to be really, really careful not to overload ourselves. Otherwise, we'll crash if you think of it in like computer terms. So there's some different types of memory, and I don't need you to be tested. You can get sent these slides afterwards, and I don't need you to be tested on this. The one that's most important here is working memory at the bottom. That's what I want you to focus on. Working memory is a bit like computer RAM. Computer RAM's job is to process and store bits of information while it's doing some other processing task so that it can then combine them or do whatever to them. The best way to explain this is, imagine I tell you to do a simple maths task like 105 take away 31. You need to do a series of little calculations. So probably you'll do 105 take away 1, and that gives you 104. But whilst you did that, you still needed to hold in your mind that you've now got 30 to still take away. And you'll need to come back to that in a minute. Because if you just do 105 take away 1, 104, and then you say, well, the answer is 104, is obviously wrong. So the whole point of working memory is to hold a few bits of information in your mind that you're going to need in a minute while you've done one particular calculation or process. And then you come back to that bit of information. You say, right, now we need to still consider that. I still need to remember that I'm subtracting. I still need to remember that I've got 30 to still take away. And I still need to remember that it was 104 left, right? 105 take away 1 was 104. So now I need to do 104 take away 30. Okay, well, I can do that. It's going to be 74. And then you go, right, have I finished the calculation? Yeah, I've not got anything else left to take away. Okay, great. 74 is the answer. I'm right down 74. Now, if you could follow that, you can see the different points at which you needed to remember different pieces of information about the task whilst you were doing one particular processing activity. And at any one point in time, it wasn't all that many pieces of information, but there was a couple, 2 or 3. Now, our working memory has about 4 different discrete chunks. You can only really process around 4 different pieces of discrete, unrelated information at the same time. And there was someone that once said, oh, it's 7 plus or minus 2, but the consensus amongst most modern neuroscientists is that they were actually considering that some of those chunks were actually related. And actually, if it's unrelated information, it's less. This means if I give you a calculation which has more than that, then unless you write things down to temporarily store them, or unless you are really rehearsing and storing them as grouped pieces of information, you're going to struggle. Now, there's loads and loads. We don't have time to go into great detail as to how they work this out. There has been a lot of research on this as to how they've worked this out. N-back tests where they give you a certain series of numbers and you've got to go and work out what the 5th number before that, the 6th number before that was. But anyway, this is quite well established. So working memory, having only around 4 possible chunks of information that can be processed and remembered simultaneously, is really important. So what's the most important thing on this slide? Anyone? I saw David, I can lip read well enough that you said working memory. Okay, very, very important. The rest of it is all interesting, but we're not going to worry about it too much. Now, cognitive load theory works like this. Any task you're going to give someone, anything you're going to show them has got an intrinsic level of cognitive load. It has some level of complexity, okay? And in theory, this was originally hypothesized to be something that's fixed. In reality, it probably is related to other aspects of someone's prior knowledge. But we can tend to imagine this as to how many different components are there to a task that are not very strongly familiar to the person that's doing it. So, for example, if you're giving someone the same task in French and in English, if they are only an English speaker, the English version is a lot easier for them to understand than the French version, which is probably impossible. However, so they obviously, the French version is much more complex because it's a series of letters they don't understand. But intrinsic cognitive load, to keep it simple, is just how complex the task is. Extraneous cognitive load is to do with the processing of the way in which that task is transmitted or the information is transmitted. So anyone heard the phrase, a picture paints 1,000 words? a fair few nods, right? A picture paints 1,000 words is basically a very classical proverb to describe how some forms of transmission have a lot more extraneous load than others. If you want to show a visual scene, it's a lot easier to do it in a picture than it is to do it with a written description, where someone has to go through a lot of mental effort to try and reconstruct what the visual's description is supposed to be. Likewise, a smell or a sound, the extraneous cognitive load of trying to describe it to somebody is way, way harder than just giving them the experience. Certain diagrams and the way in which a diagram is constructed and the complexity of the diagram to an extent. Some diagrams are needlessly complex. They have more components than they need to have to show the information you wanted to show. The extraneous cognitive load is higher. The domain cognitive load is the amount of effort that is used to combine and create new links between unrelated ideas. Generally speaking, and I say generally speaking, there are some cases where this is not perhaps the case, but generally speaking, this is the one we want. We want students to be doing this and not necessarily having to worry too much about the other two. Now, the idea is that the intrinsic one we can't do much about. We can't do much about the intrinsic one because if we've got to teach them something which has got an inherent level of complexity, it's got an inherent level of complexity. The extraneous one we can reduce, and the domain cognitive load, we want that to be relatively high. And we want people to be spending most of their working memory joining ideas together, creating linkages and using those linkages, practicing a method, right? And it can be everything from riding a bike to doing algebra. Yeah, the same principle in theory applies. The more things we try and get them to do simultaneously, the harder it's going to be for them. We want to keep it as simple as we can, but will still allow them to develop links together. And I always say to people, working memory has 4 chunks, but it works a lot better if you don't try and use all 4. Try and focus on 2 or 3 new things at the same time, at most. And try and make sure that 1 or 2 of those are already familiar. So they're adding on 1 building block at a time. And then you can move on. One example of this, for example, is when I've taught people the nitrogen cycle. If you teach the nitrogen cycle and you just show them a picture, it's really quite complex. And they see a picture of an animal doing a poo, and that's got something to do with nitrate and ammonia and all the rest of it. And it's quite confusing for students the first time they've seen it, even if they understand what all the words mean. And if they don't understand what all the words mean, it's really impossible. And there's arrows going left, right, and center because there's things that go up and down. There's things that go left and right. It looks pretty confusing. If you don't believe me, just go and look up a nitrogen cycle. Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, JP, yeah, you've obviously taught this one as well. Now, the best way I've found to teach the nitrogen cycle is to draw 1 bit of it at a time with an arrow to the next bit and talk about just those 2 bits before we do anything else. And then draw the next arrow and draw the next bit and explain that bit before they do anything else, because the extraneous cognitive load is minimized. They only have to focus on 1 bit of the diagram at a time because they can't see any more of it because it's not there yet. And then they learn and they do the domain cognitive load. They do the linking of what on earth is nitrate? Why on earth is it there? How did it get there? What's it going to do in a minute? What is it? Okay. And they learn about that before they go on to the next step. So it becomes familiar to them when they do the next step. I'm adding 1 new element at a time. And you can try this by just giving them a whole picture, but that's hard. And actually, I've drawn the nitrogen cycle myself hundreds of times in my life. And now it's really easy to teach. But break things down. Do them step by step. It really, really works. And it seems simple and straightforward, but simple and straightforward is sometimes the way forward. There's an example task here. We've only got 9 minutes. I'm going to go quite quickly. But these 4 sequences of symbols, I'm not actually going to get you to do the whole task. But if I take this away in a minute, who reckons they're going to remember the first sequence of symbols? The top one. Put your hand up if you think you're going to remember that in 5-minute time. Everyone backs themselves. Who reckons they're going to remember the second sequence? Pretty much everyone. Most people nodding. Who reckons they're going to remember the third one in 5 minutes' time? People are getting iffy. Who reckons they're going to remember the 4th series? We're seeing a lot of laughing, thumbs down. Why is the 4th one harder? They're all the same number of symbols. And they're all symbols made with lines and crosses and whatever else. Unknown, unfamiliar, right? We have no idea what to even call those symbols. We can't group them together in any way. They don't link to any existing schema. And Sam's saying I've changed the examples, so her efforts to try and remember the ones that I used on the previous time. She can't. So the first one is obviously is a semantic idea, right? You know what a flagpole is, and you understand the idea of a plural, so you can go flagpoles. Yeah, lots and lots of flagpoles, right? Fine. Duggle-bop means nothing, but at least it's a coherent sound. So you can say it and then decode the sound of it to try and work out the letters, because you could do phonetics. And then we've got XCS, ZPK, OSQ. Right, now that doesn't make any coherent sound. It just seems like nonsense, but at least they're letters that you know. Duggle-bop is a dance move. It's not a dance move that I know. But I'm glad somebody else might be able to do a dance to it. Now, the last one, you don't even have names for most of these things. All right, you can call one of them a hash, and you can call one of them a crown, and one of them is a triangle with a line through it. But you probably don't have names to describe each of these symbols. So you're trying to describe each symbol as a series of shapes and geometric lines. That's hard. So you're trying to say the first one's a diamond with a line sticking out of the right-hand side. Well, that's more complicated on its own than just remembering the word flagpoles, right? So it's very difficult to try and remember. So if I take this away and say, go and write down those 4 different sequences of symbols, all of you are going to get the first one right. And if anyone gets the last one right, you get definitely in for a medal. Yeah. So anyway, practical applications and techniques. We have honestly gone through a blistering pace. Has anyone got questions so far? I've tried to cover what in some cases that would be a week's worth of training into an hour. It's a bit of a challenge. It's made some sense. It could have been 2 hours minimum. Yeah, probably. It could actually. I actually did this for a week in Uganda, and I did obviously give them a lot. There was a lot more as well, but I've tried to give all the core bits into the TTA CPD. The new one does not, I'm afraid. No, but we can potentially try and add this in. Practical applications and techniques. So a lot of what I've talked about so far is just theory, ideas, and it's not very useful for you to then be sent away. Okay, and go, well, use cognitive load theory in your classroom. Okay, maybe you can break down some of your tasks into more simple forms. But there are some things that are legitimately very useful. And I don't want you to go back and try and say, oh, well, let's try and find a visual learner and give them pictures. And let's try and find an auditory learner and talk to them all day long. Here are just a series of techniques that genuinely work, that are based on some of these principles. The first one is the easiest one to probably understand. Retrieval practice. Who wants to hazard a guess as to what this is? Someone should surely do this, otherwise we're not leaving the lesson until somebody can answer the question. What's retrieval practice? It's not a trick question. Practicing remembering stuff. Practicing recall. Recall is part of it, but it's more complicated than recall because it is about retrieving, using those connections that were previously built at any point in time. Can be riding a bike. Riding a bike is retrieval practice for the motor skills of being able to balance and pedal and all the rest of it. So retrieval practice does not necessarily mean rote learning. Okay, Danny said, is it the opposite? Is it do passive learning? So often we hear, people will have often heard in education, passive and active learning. Retrieval practice is active learning in the sense of the actively thinking, but not active learning as it was sometimes taught in schools as all your kids have got to get up and run around, which is just nonsense. If they're doing maths, it does not help them to get up and run around. I can promise you. Okay, but it is active in the sense that they are actively thinking. They are trying to retrieve from their memory a process, or not just one single piece of information, but some of the network, some of the schema. They're trying to retrieve some of the schema. So writing an essay, for example, is retrieval practice because they're trying to produce a response to a question that requires them to retrieve knowledge from their schema, to prioritize it appropriately in ways that relate to how they've been taught previously. And I mean, retrieval practice can be used in every possible educational context, and it is. It is an active effort in terms of mental effort. Does not mean that they need to be physically active, like running around. That's not what it means. But retrieval practice, if you're going to brainwash somebody, which is effectively just an extreme form of education, you just get them to repeatedly say what it is you want them to have remembered. Yeah. What's the party slogan? And you just drill it into them until they know it every day. And they sing the national anthem at the beginning of the day every day. So they learn the national anthem. Now, brainwashing can be good or can be bad, depending on what you brainwash them to do. Right? Brainwashing obviously has a negative connotation. But the idea, the principle is you're just going to keep getting them to retrieve it until they've just really built strong connections. Priming. Anyone know what priming is? Does anyone want to explain it? Go on then, JP.
It's where you associate two things. So I think they did an experiment where they popped a balloon whenever someone's football team lost, and they got them to the point where they could just pop a balloon and make them really angry. So
that's classical conditioning, which is closely related to priming, but slightly different. And the difference is, so classical conditioning is a really, really, I mean, Pavlov's dogs is the famous initial example, right? And the one you're telling me there is very similar. Priming is slightly different in that priming is when you give people a stimulus before you expect them to learn about it. So they're familiar with the stimulus or the idea, right? So, for example, if I've often done this, well, there was a situation where I had a student who I taught physics to this student, and he despised physics. But I kept it pre-teaching. Sometimes it's called pre-teaching, yeah, or pre-exposure. It's got a few different names. But I was giving this student references. Oh, that's as easy as quantum mechanics, or that's a bit like quantum mechanics, or quantum mechanics is so cool. When eventually that child then said, "Well, what is quantum mechanics?" And I was like, "Aha, brilliant! I can explain quantum mechanics in a simple way." And then by the time they went, when that child went and told their parent that they know what quantum mechanics is, the parent nearly fell off their chair. In fact, they were completely astonished. This was the child. They said, they're never going to like physics, but please can you try and drag them through the last bit of their GCSE? And so when the child actually said, like, oh, yeah, I know what quantum mechanics is, the parent was astonished. But it was because of priming. Now, that's one quite extreme example, but it's any pre-exposure of something so they become more familiar with the concept, even any elements of the ideas before you then try and link them together. We're really at the end now, so we're gonna just go through the last ones in a couple of words each. Mental cognition is thinking about thinking. How well they know about what they know. Do they think they understand it? Do they know where their strengths and weaknesses are, rather than just having to respond to whatever? Scaffolding, a bit like building a house. When you want to put the roof on, you put all the scaffolding up so you can reach it and you can add it on, and then you take it away at the end. It looks like the roof magically has now appeared on the house. How on earth did it get there? But obviously, we all know that somebody put something up to get to it. We're doing the same thing in education. If we're providing a lot of support for a child to get the right answer, and then gradually removing the support, right? If we show them the method that they should follow, and then they do the little bits themselves, and then gradually take away some of the information. Directed instruction is about clarity of explanation and about really being specific in helping students identify exactly what it is they need to do by telling them exactly each step. Space learning is where you get them to practice something, and then you leave an interval to do something else. They practice something again at a future point in time, and then they keep doing it. So they keep coming back to this retrieval practice, but it's much more efficient than just loads and loads of retrieval practice in one go. And repetition. Again, the more people repeat stuff, they more remember it. And I think everyone knows that. Anyway, we've just about run over. But I'm happy to stay for 1 or 2 minutes if people have got questions. And I hope you found it at least mildly interesting. Any questions? No. If there's no questions, I'm looking forward to seeing you all at any event soon, whether it's a community hub or the National Tutoring Awards or Tuition Leadership Day, the conference in November, regional events, or any other events that are going on. I hope you have a you're having a productive exam season if you're teaching exams. Is there anywhere you would recommend looking at more about schema theory? It depends how much you want to look it up. I've not found any really good entry-level accessible descriptions of schema theory. Well, not many. So that's, I suppose, something we can look at. But if you read the original papers by Sweller, or what's his name? John Sweller, I think it was. That they are, that's obviously pretty dense because you're reading the original research and the original descriptions. Let me have a think about that, and we'll need to come back to you.
I have just put a video in the chat to a session that John did a couple of years ago on schema theory.
Oh yeah, we had an hour just on schema theory
which
a few years ago.
Start.
Hopefully that will help. Thank you, Sam. Refutations of Gardner's ideas. Okay, Tony, let me have a look at that, and I'll try and send something to you. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.